Welcome to Solutions OP Clinical Trials Podcast. My name is Olga and I'm the Managing Director of Solutions OP. We are a small team of experienced professionals working on clinical trials in the United Kingdom. I'll use our podcast to discuss hot topics in clinical trials and provide analysis of the latest trends and challenges in pharma and medical device industries, not just in the UK but globally. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the latest episode of the podcast. Today the topic is diversity plans and where do we start and why do we need them and all this. So for those of you who work in the industry, you're probably frowning, you're thinking, oh gosh, yeah, diversity plans. But actually, diversity plans are not just some fancy word. And there are a lot more. And if you decide to listen to this podcast, I'll explain a little bit more about diversity plans in clinical research and why they're so important and what you can do about it. So in order to have a new drug or medical device on the market, obviously you need to conduct clinical trials and test it in a specific patient population. And then you use that generated data to submit to the regulators in different regions. So when we're talking about diversity, as I say, it's not just a fancy expression or anything to do with politics or whatever. But this is something really important in terms of having a proper representation of clinical trials participants in your clinical trial, and also making sure that you meet the regulatory requirements, because there are regulators who have already started requesting to have this diversity in clinical trials. And it's not something new. That's been ongoing for a long time. But lately, there is more and more accent on this. As we'll speak about it in a moment. But let's start with this. In November 2023, there were 21 out of 84 UK research ethics committees who participated in a debate regarding diversity in clinical trials, and they all concluded that there are a lot of patient groups which are underrepresented in the current research, and that we need to do more to allow access to different patients to clinical trials. While some regulators like the US FDA, they already have a diversity plan requirements for clinical trials. You're probably familiar if you're working with them. If not, I strongly recommend you look into their guidance. It's very, very good guidance and provides you really a good input what you need to provide. But there's also a diversity plan guidance which is currently under development in the UK, and I'm absolutely sure you can see something coming from the European Medicines Agency as well in the very near future. So diversity in clinical trials is getting more of the attention of the regulators, and it's something that you really need to consider seriously. So why do we need these diversity plans? You're asking, oh, come on, this is really, why do we need this? While we have to all agree that people, we might consider them equal, in reality, we know that people are different. So this is completely, purely biological or whatever physiological sense you want to put into the word, but people are different and they respond differently to treatment. And that's not only about drugs, but this is about medical devices as well. So there've been some reports lately saying that some patients, for example, were not diagnosed correctly by a medical device because of the skin tone and so on. So this is affecting not just the drug development, but also the medical devices. And it's very important to understand this, that people are different and they could even experience the diseases in a different way. So what works for a patient in Europe may not necessarily work for the patient in Asia. And this is why we need to have representation of different patients and different patient populations. So it was very interesting because in 2019 there was a publication. The authors did a research and analysis of 230 clinical trials which were conducted in a period between 2008 and 2018, and they found that only 37% of these studies did not report race. But if you think about, this is quite a huge percentage. So 37% of the studies didn't collect any data about race for these patients who participated in these clinical trials. Why, you would think? Well, why did they not collect this one? Well, maybe it was because of data protection laws, or maybe they just didn't consider the information to be relevant. So they just didn't collect it. So let's go into discussing a little bit what are the main challenges when it comes to diversity in clinical trials. So one of the challenges is the trust in our regulatory agencies. So I know it doesn't sound good, but that's the reality. FDA had a survey with 2,021 participants in March 2023, and they discovered that 23% of the potential participants in clinical trials, they were not, they didn't trust the FDA. They didn't trust the regulatory agency about their decisions and so on. And the survey found that these people are potentially living in the rural areas, and they have less trust in FDA than in the big cities. So this is not unique to FDA. It's very important to understand. Yes, the FDA have this this survey and this information, but I think it affects all regulatory agencies around the world. So it's not specific for FDA. That's very important to remember. So what is the cause of this mistrust? So part of the problem is sometimes we have people who have worked in big corporations for a long time, and then they decide to move and they go to work for the regulatory agency. Now, generally, this is not necessarily a bad thing because these people bring the industry experience into the regulators, and it gives them a different point of view, if you want, on the problems. But from the perspective of the general public, this could be seen like big corporations influencing the regulatory agencies in some way. So this is, I think, one of the big reasons why there is a mistrust in the regulators. That exchange of people between big corporations and the regulators could be seen as something negative from the general public. Another example of this issue with the trust in regulators is the way, for example, the COVID-19 vaccines were approved. Everyone, at the time, felt that was very prompt and very quick. But many people were left with concerns because they're thinking, well, other drugs take so many years to get onto the market, and now all of a sudden you approve this, and did you really do the job right? So that kind of examples just give you an idea why there is a mistrust and why people sometimes don't have confidence in the regulatory agencies. So I think it's very important for the regulators to be a lot more transparent and to try to build, to show to people that they're trustworthy and reliable. But this has to come from them, and they need to be a lot more transparent how they operate, what they do, who's making the decisions and so on. Because I think many people in the general public, they see them as one big thing. They don't understand how that thing operates internally. So that's one part. Another part which is a problem for people participating in research is the language barrier. I think, especially now that we have so many people traveling around the world, moving to live in different places, we come across patients and potential participants in research who don't necessarily speak the language of the country where they are in. And while in the UK, for example, we encourage researchers to consider everyone and provide translated patient information sheets and so on. In some countries, like Germany, they are actually not allowed to consider patients who don't speak the language because they have other concerns for their safety, if they'll be able to communicate, if they have any issues and so on. So there are different approaches in different parts of the world towards these language barriers. But as a general rule, I think it's more likely that patients will be excluded rather than trying to provide a provision for them to consider them for participating in research. So another important thing is the heavy use of technology. So, although if you work for a company which is conducting clinical trials, you think, but it's great. They put a bracelet, it measures everything, it goes to a server. We have a real live data that we can see when we log in and so on. But the reality is, yes, it's convenient for the company who's conducting the study, but it might not necessarily be convenient for the patients who participate in the study and for the participants. You might have an elderly population where they might not necessarily feel very comfortable with this, using apps and devices and so on, or you might have people who are concerned about being tracked all the time because they have anxiety, for example. So I think it's very important to try to make it easy, not just for yourself as a company conducting research, but making it easy for the patients as well. Give them options so that you can consider, if someone's not comfortable with this, to have other options for them to use. And also take that into consideration when you're designing the initial study and in your setting up. So another very important criteria actually for limiting participation in research is the inclusion criteria restrictions. So we see a lot of eligibility criteria which are related to age or pregnancy. In some cases that's really reasonable. You want to exclude these patients or participants, but in others, that's not necessarily the best approach. So, I can understand if you're doing a phase 1 study or pivotal study, and you want to have patients who have less comorbidities and disease burden. Yes, you want to have a younger patients to participate in your study. But it is also important to think about, are you actually excluding your real life patient population? And is that really justified? Just because you want to have less adverse events, because you exclude those who have a heavy, disease burden, is that really the best approach? So you need to think about that and see when it's justified to exclude these patients. Another thing that we see a lot in protocols is just the blank exclusion of patients with HIV or hepatitis, even though they might be stable, they might be on long-term therapy, they're just excluded. So in some cases, if you have a drug, for example, which interacts with their therapy, of course you exclude them because of safety reasons. But there are other cases where it's not really necessary to exclude these patients, and you should give them the chance to participate in research. Another example is sometimes the protocols create a lot of restrictions. I'll give an example with a condition called benign ethical neutropenia. So this is a medical condition which is observed in patients with African ancestry. So they tend to have neutropenia, which is not necessarily associated with increased risk of infection. It's just a genetic condition. But if you look into many clinical trials protocols, you see that there are very strict requirements about neutrophils, and such patient groups are not even considered. So if they don't meet the requirements, you have to exclude them simply because, that's what is put in the protocol, and you want everyone to meet this requirement. So I think when designing a protocol, it's really important to think about different genetic diseases, or if you're excluding patient population simply because you haven't thought about it. So try to think from different angles and do your research really well before you set up your eligibility criteria. Another thing, recently FDA issued a very good guidance recommending changes in the eligibility criteria in oncology clinical trials, and they're asking protocols to be more relaxed in terms of mobility status, required lab parameters, and disease burden. So they're hoping that if the protocols are a bit more relaxed, that will include more patients and allow more diverse population to participate in clinical trials. So let's a little bit consider what we need to think about when we're developing diversity plan. So just a few points here. So the first one is to collect the correct information. If you think about, it's good to have the information about race, ethnicity, sex, and age of the patient or participant in the clinical trial. It might sound strange, but not all clinical trials collect that information. So basically, you can't really tell what kind of patients or participants you've had in your study. Another important part is to select the hospitals that have the diverse patient population. I know it's a lot easier when you go to the big centers, the well-known centers, and these well-known centers may not necessarily have the diverse population that you need. So you need to be a bit more flexible and try and think of other sites that you might involve that might have a kind of different patient population that they see there. And you have to find, of course, the right balance between, having sites with experience and having the right patient population that will allow diversity. So this is something that you really need to think and discuss internally. Another important aspect is increasing the awareness of clinical research among physicians. It's a very common issue that physicians don't refer patients to clinical trials. It's not just in the UK. I think it's a global issue. And the problem is, it could be that the physicians don't know about this study, which is for patients with their indication, or they might not have the time to refer patients. So it's important to bring awareness, make sure that whoever is working in that area is really familiar that there's a study ongoing and where is the study, so that they can refer patients. But another important thing to consider is how to make these referrals as easy as possible so that people can refer patients to clinical trials. And of course, even though it doesn't sound like very obvious, I think it's very important to also think about the financial aspect, that these referral sites might need to have some financial benefit from doing that work. So that's another thing that you can do to stimulate them to participate and refer patients. Another important part here is the creating patient-friendly clinical trials. I know you'll probably say, oh, well, yeah, that's easy said, but not, not really easy to do. But the reality is, you need to think about the standard of care for these patients who participate in clinical trials or participants, and you try to keep it as simple as possible for them. I know what you say to me, well, Olga, there are regulatory requirements, so we have to consider these. Of course, you have to consider these, but that doesn't stop you from thinking how to make it easier for patients to participate. So not just think about what data I need. Of course, this is very important, but think about how do I make it easier so that I can recruit more patients and we have different people who will have the opportunity to participate. So that's really important thing to think about. Of course, you can think of different options. For example, decentralized clinical trials where you give more opportunities to and more flexibility to patients to be seen by a local physician or nurse to attend their home, different options. Also, you have to consider reimbursing patient travel expenses. And while you might not necessarily think this is so important, but it is important if you want to allow patients and participants with low socioeconomic status to take part in research. You really need to think how to help them and reimburse them for their travel expenses so that they can take part, because they might want to take part, but because of the financial issues, they might not necessarily have the capacity to pay all the train journeys or everything just to go to the hospital. Of course, for many medical device companies and many drugs which are already approved on the market, real-world evidence studies are a really good option to allow to include more diverse population, because you doing this, it's like observation of patients and participants already using the device or the drug. So that will give a opportunity to have more diverse population, especially if you're doing any post-market surveillance. So another important part is patient engagement and training. So working in a specific disease area is great, because then you can work with different patient organizations, charities, and really contribute to help increase patients' health knowledge, so that they can learn more about their disease and give them opportunity to have materials which are in a patient-friendly language, and they can learn a lot more about research as well. So this is something which many companies don't see as beneficial, at least, when you do your initial phase 1-2 studies and you're thinking, well, that's great, but I don't necessarily have a budget for this. But actually, this is a great investment, because if you want your product to be, patients to be aware of your product and your brand, providing training sessions and different materials is a great way to reach out to patients and try to really support them, so that they can see that you really want to help them in a long term. But again, we shouldn't really restrict all that to companies, to medical device and pharma companies. We really need to think about it as a more bigger commitment from the regulatory agencies, from charities, and everyone who is involved in research, even on a governmental level. I think it is important that we have these training programs and we encourage people to learn what research is and improve their overall knowledge about their medical condition. I think this is important, not just only for the sake of research, but for the patients themselves to to learn more about their disease and how to manage it better. So I think this is a very important part. And at the end you ask, okay, well, is there any shortcut? So, of course, we always think about how can we do it more cost effective? How can we do it easier? And you might wonder, okay, can I just go and set up my clinical trial in developing countries and then I'll meet all diversity requirements? I don't need to worry about anything. All boxes ticked. Now, the answer to this is yes and no. Now, by no way you have to be discouraged to run clinical trials in developing countries. Of course, you can do clinical trials there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that data will be automatically accepted by the regulators, for example, in the US or in Europe and so on. And the reason for this one is in the developing countries, people can have poor health. They might not have the same standard of living, and they might not have the same standard of care. So if I have, for example, someone from rural Africa who lives in Africa, and I have someone from rural Africa who lives, for example, in France, and they have access to the French healthcare system and everything else, their outcome, their disease burden, everything could be different. So it is important to think about these options as well when you run clinical trials and you think about diversity. So it is a lot more complex than just going to some country where you think it will work. The other thing is that you need to take into consideration is that many regulatory agencies might require data from their part of the world when you're applying for marketing authorization. For example, China would want to see Chinese patients. European Union also would like to see patients from Europe who are representative of European Union. US FDA also would like to see US patients participating in clinical trials. So it's not a simple solution. It's more complex. But with a proper design and really engaging with the patient groups and charities, I think this could help a lot in creating a proper diversity plan and including more and more patients in your research. Because it benefits you as a company who conducts the clinical trial, but also it benefits all these patients who have limited treatment options. So I hope you find this podcast interesting, and speak to you soon in the next episode.